All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Doug and Carmi Show, your one-stop shop for all things Commanders. As we gear up for a new season from Locked On Commanders podcast, we welcome David Harrison. David, how are you?
I'm doing good, guys. How are you doing?
Doing real good. First time to the show. We always try to get to know folk a little bit. How is it that we've come to find you on Locked On Commanders? How did you get started in the industry?
So I got started in the industry when I was in the Army prior to doing all this, and one of my best friends while I was in the Army actually was killed. And when he died, it kind of it rocked my world a little bit. It kind of put me in a mindset of trying to figure out like what I was, like what am I doing all this for? Like what's after this? You know what I mean? What's next? And he and I always bonded over football. He was a Florida Gator fan. I'm an Ohio State Buckeye fan. So there was a little bit of a back and forth there with the Gators getting the best of the Buckeyes for a little bit. So that's just kind of something. It's, I've always loved football, and that's something that my dad and I bonded over as well. So just kind of reached out one day and, I was like, hey, I'm interested in writing about football if anybody's got opportunities. And there was a guy who's starting up a website. He couldn't pay me, couldn't offer me any real platform. It was just like, hey, if you want to roll, let's roll. So I was like, yeah, let's do it. And just kind of from there it grew. And I was able to retire in 2020 from the Army, and we chose Virginia to move into, and kind of just reached out to the local area and just worked my way into the local beat. And here I am, third year now covering the Washington Commanders. So truly blessed. But yeah, that's kind of where I was born from.
You've 3 years means you've seen the bad, the ugly, and we're hoping the good. We've been trying to do our best on the podcast, David, of not trashing the old group because they're not here anymore. So really, what is the point? Everybody knows the history. But I am curious some of your thoughts on the changes that you've seen around the program, around the park that maybe from a distance we can't see.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough, to kind of come in towards the tail end of it. Like I got enough of it, living while, working it while it was happening, but fortunately just the back end and, the transition. And it really is just a night and day different organization, and I think that's kind of the best way to put it is just to let everybody know, like there really is, a lot of change happening. And, whether or not that change impacts the win-loss column as much as people want to right away is not, it's still kind of to be seen. But I think the important thing is to understand that, that the ship is getting turned around and is being done for the right reasons. And you have someone, all the way at the top, Josh Harris. I was able to ask him on Sunday before the final preseason game, how much his lifelong fandom of the franchise is driving some of the things that he's doing. And he acknowledged that that's a big part of it. He remembers the glory days. He's not just a guy who, like I didn't grow up a fan of this franchise, you know what I mean? So I know the history of it. I mean, I was a fan of Art Monk, you know what I mean? Brett Rippon was a guy that I was a fan of as a football fan, just generally speaking. So I remember it too, but he remembers it at a much more intimate level. You know what I mean? Like he lived being a fan of this organization. So he knows what that means and he wants to bring it back. And, you look around the stadium, like it's the same house, right? It's the same building that it was before. Like you can't tear it down and rebuild it. But even just like new flooring, it seems like such a small thing. But if anybody's ever refloored a house, well, imagine reflooring an entire NFL stadiums. Like that's that's the investment that he just put in, and it's got like this grip surface, so it's hopefully non-slick and all that stuff, and new paint and all that. Like it kind of seems on the surface like a small thing to do, but in reality, it's actually quite the investment, especially in a building that you're not going to be in 6 years or so. And then that's just kind of the smallest example, but there's efforts across the building, and then in Ashburn as well, things that people aren't going to see. And I think it's just kind of an example of, you have an owner there who genuinely wants this organization to be top shelf, and wants the fans to understand that.
The GM has made it clear that while they're building to be successful now, they recognize, 65% turnover of the roster. I don't think it'd be shocking if there's 40% again next year. So while they're trying to do things for the now, he's made it clear we also know that we're trying to build something for the future. How have they done in the first year?
I mean, I think they've done a bang up job of addressing and getting the guys they want, right? The guys they feel fit the mold, from a characteristic and a personality standpoint. And right now that's the best you can do, until you get everybody on the field and see who's really cut out to play this NFL game and who maybe needs to move on. to other places. And I think that's, what I really like about what they're doing, and I kind of talked about this in my own episode actually that just dropped today, is there's been a lot of times where we've criticized the staffs and the decision makers that have been here for trying to take a guy who doesn't fit in the role you thought they'd fit in, but still just trying to cram that piece into that role, right? Jamin Davis stands out as one of those guys who, this team drafted him for one thing. It didn't work. They kind of moved him, like, to give him a little bit of credit, right? They kind of moved him, but really they didn't. They just moved him parallel on the same level of the defense to another spot. It still didn't really work out. And they never really gave it a chance. So this staff came in and really go back to the scouting combine. I think is the first time we heard Dan Quinn talk about Jamin as an edge rusher. And it's something that's interesting because around that time I actually did an episode where you have very few pass rush snaps to study of Jamin Davis. But in those few pass rush snaps you could study, you actually see some potential there. And Dan and his staff saw that potential there. And now they've gone full speed at, let's try to remodel this player in his contract year and see if we can make something of this. And that's something that the last staff just wasn't willing to do. So trading Jahan Dotson, I know a lot of people didn't like it or necessarily appreciate it. I know some fans said they gave up on him way too quickly, but again, you kind of go back to the history. We've been criticizing this team for trying to jam, round pegs into square holes for all this time. And now they said, look, you're just not a fit for this team for whatever reason. You don't fit what we're trying to do. So instead of sitting here for an entire year trying to force this thing, let's just move it. Let's just move you to a place where you can be better and get something back. And now we can take that draft capital and get something that does fit our roster. So they've done exactly what we basically wanted the other staff to do all this time, yet they're still getting criticized. So that's just the business. You're going to get criticized no matter what you do. But I do think it's important to note, that this staff is not doing that. They have a very clear idea of what they want. If you don't fit that for whatever reason, doesn't mean you're a bad person. Just means you're not a fit here. So we're going to help you go somewhere. John Ridgway to the Saints in New Orleans. He's potentially the third defensive tackle. Kalen Saunders is injured, so he might even get more reps while he's on the mend there. In Washington, at best, he was fourth. You know what I mean? So again, it's a situation where you're not going to fill a role for us, so we'll get something back for you and let you go fill a role somewhere else. And I think that's the best way to do it.
I thought it was interesting. Adam Peters said in the press conference that the first book he got, notebook from the Patriots, right? In there basically said, we are not collecting football players. We're building a roster. And I really thought, like, I hadn't heard it put that way, but boy, it made a lot of sense.
Absolutely. So to that end, I think the team does a really good job of highlighting players' strengths and putting them in positions to be successful. I'm just curious, David, because you're at the field, training camp quite often. Are there any players under the radar, people that we're not necessarily paying attention to, that kind of stood out to you over the summer? Like some players that kind of popped to you that you are excited to see play this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the guys who have flown under the radar, I think now they're firmly on everybody's radar, and some of that comes from making the active roster. Right? A guy like Tyler Owens, I kind of jokingly pat myself on the back there. Like week 2 of training camp is kind of where I started honing in on Tyler Owens, and I'm not smarter than everybody else. I just got lucky because we all have our guys that we latch on to. But Tyler is a guy that for a little bit flew under the radar. I think everybody kind of caught on to him, especially that second preseason game. I think by then everybody kind of knew who number 40 was, but he's a guy that's really impressed. Colson Yankov is actually, so he's the one that I'm kind of kicking myself on, because we go back to the post-draft press conference after everything was wrapped up. And Colson, looking at the undrafted free agents, Colson's not a guy that I studied. And so I saw his name on there. I said, okay, who's this guy? Pulled up the UCLA data, found out he was also in Washington, pulled up some Washington tape, pulled up some UCLA tape. I was like, man, this dude's just a baller. Like, he's just a football player. So he caught my attention really quickly. I asked Dan about him in that post-draft press conference. And then from that moment till he made the active roster, never asked about him again. But I spent a lot of time at practices just watching Colson, just watching his effort on the field and watching him run up and down the field. But he's a guy that, even though we talk as a beat, talked about him quite often on the sideline, none of us really ever latched on to him as a potential roster player. I even went as far as to say, like, if Cole Turner doesn't make it, because, quite honestly, he just didn't deserve to make it, they might just go 3 tight ends and maybe take a bigger receiver that can maybe kind of fill in to that wide tight end role in certain packages. But they didn't. They kept that fourth tight end, which is kind of the direction I thought they would go. But they kept Colson for all those reasons that Dan told us. They kept him in the press conference after the roster was released. And, so he's a guy that has really kind of carved out his own niche, so much in the fact that, the first practice after he was on the active roster, he was on the field. He was the last guy on the field. Yeah. And when he was walking off the field, we're all standing there. and he's walking a different direction. Doesn't even realize we want to talk to him. Like it doesn't even click in his head yet. Like you're the guy that we want to talk to, that we're all waiting for. So
Love
you know it's a great story because you know if he can stick around on the roster, we know this thing is super fluid, right? But if he can stick around, it's gonna be really interesting to see where he gets his opportunity to make an impact.
In that first preseason game, David, they teased us with a little of the pistol. They haven't. They've shown a little bit more actually than I thought maybe they would have shown in the preseason with some of the formations. But yet there's not been any real motion. They didn't need to show you hurry up. Terry is the national guys have loved to say, "Oh, here we go with Cliff again." Terry didn't leave from his side of the field, but yet I know that I heard Terry, whether unintentionally or not, say that in practice they've been moving him around a lot. Is there stuff that you've been seeing at practice that maybe you can tell us what you think the offense may look like? Because I think it's one of the bigger question marks of the preseason.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more from the offense in training camp practices than what has been shown in the preseason games, right? And that's across the league. Every offensive coordinator, every defensive coordinator even does that. You know, Joey Jr. actually even said like he hasn't played any games, you know, with his pass rush yet. That's not actually true. I've actually spotted some games that he's played with the pass rush, but he's very limited in what he's doing. And you know, John Allen, Deron Payne, Bobby Wagner haven't even been on the field together, you know, yet in actual live competition. So there's a lot that hasn't been shown in the preseason games by design, and a lot more that we've seen in training camp. And yeah, Terry did, you know, let loose that he's moved around quite a bit. There has been motion. Like I can tell you this, like I haven't charted how much motion they've used, but I can tell you it's to the point where nobody out there every day has said, man, they don't use a lot of motion just watching practice, right? So it's at least enough that it doesn't stand out as something that's used to a deficient level. So, you know, now that being said, I kind of go back to last year and the lesson that we learned, like every year, even as reporters and podcasters, like everybody should learn every year. Every year you should try to get better. So what I'm trying to learn this year is, you know what, I saw a lot of stuff from Eric Bieniemy at this point last year as well, that I was like, we'll see this in the regular season. And we never saw that stuff in the regular season. So I don't know why he installed it. Hopefully Cliff Kingsbury, Anthony Lynn, Brian Johnson aren't installing a bunch of stuff that they have no intention of using. But you know, if they use the things that they've installed, people are going to be, that narrative is going to go away eventually. Like maybe right off the bat, you have a rookie quarterback, so it might be a little bit simplistic, you know, in the first couple of weeks, but eventually it should go away, especially the better Jaden does, the better he, you know, accelerates to the NFL game once it gets really live in week one. The more Cliff will be able to unveil more of what they've been working on.
Quick follow-up, George. Do you think that do you get the sense that they plan on bringing him along slowly? Like, you know, a lot of the RPO stuff, don't hang it on him. Let's see how the offensive line works. Or do you think, I mean, with all the experience he has, he's not your typical rookie quarterback. I mean, yes, he's not played NFL games yet, but how much do you think they'll put on his plate early?
I mean, I think every coach with a young with any quarterback, right? You want to go out there and do what they're comfortable with, right? And a coaching staff that talks about putting the guys in the best position to be successful, that's kind of the mantra there, is do what players are more comfortable with. So what Jaden is most comfortable with is what Cliff is going to want to do, especially right off the bat. You know, I do expect, you know, some of the things you see in the preseason, some of the quick passes and things like that, those are going to be part of that game. But you want that to be part of that game because when you have a quarterback like Jaden who can run the ball but also sling it, you want the defense to have to react to those quick balls, because the more you're creeping up, the more we have opportunities to go above you and over you. And honestly, even in the run game, you know, if you got a left side corner who's playing up press and you got a left side safety who's in the box because they got to try to defend those quick passes and Jaden escapes out the right side, now those defenders are in a less advantageous situation to try to pursue from the backside, and Jaden's speed, you're not going to catch him. So if you can't get an angle on him on your side of the field to try to get ahead of him to bring him down, you're toast. You're out of the race before you ever even get into it. So there's multiple levels to where that can benefit you. But I do expect the running backs to be heavily involved. Do expect the tight ends to be heavily involved. And I think that's only going to suit Jaden the best. But yeah, the more Jaden can do, the more Jaden feels comfortable with. And I think the great thing about Jaden too is he's being honest, because as honest as he's being with us, he's being even more honest with the coaches, right? So he knew, like yesterday's press conference, for example, he knows Dan Quinn came out there and said, I want guys to get away from football during this long weekend a little bit and just kind of step away from it. So when we ask him, do your plans this weekend involve football? He knows that the right answer is no, I'm going to get away from it like coach wants me to, but he can't, right? You can kind of tell he kind of had that internal struggle for a second, but he eventually says like, no, like probably not, like football just never goes away completely. So he's always being honest. So if he's being honest with us, he's being honest with them. And he acknowledges that he's got things he's got to get better at as well. And as far as like concern for the offensive line, though, I don't think so. Like, I think in this business, you got to tell your starting five, like, you got to get out there, you got to do the job. Like, we're not going to roll it out easier for you, right? The O-line, you got to block it up. Like, that's what you're out there to do. So you got to make sure you go get the job done. I think all those guys understand that.
David, is there a side of the ball that you feel more comfortable with? Because I feel like the offense has that explosive capability with Jaden Daniels. They have some veteran wide receivers, so there's a kind of a high floor in regard to what they could do. But, this defensive staff is known for its defense, obviously, right? Dan Quinn, Joe Witt. We have Bobby Wagner back there as well. But, all of us are into this. We're all passionate about it. We're hearing that the defense might be a concern. I'm hearing that from Rick Snyder, JP Finley as well. I don't know if you kind of share the same sentiments. What are your thoughts on the offensive and defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of feel like we know more about the offense just because we've been able to see more of them, right? Because, I mean, we're on the defensive side of things, like your top three players, Payne Allen and Wagner aren't even on the field. On the offensive side of the ball, you don't have that problem, right? I don't know who everybody would call their top three, but let's say it's Terry, Sam, and Jaden. Like, those three guys have been on the field. We've seen them, we've seen what they can do. So we've seen them consistently in practice, but we've also seen them in the joint practices and the preseason games. The thing that gives me a little bit of confidence in the defense right now is that during the joint practices against the Jets and the Dolphins, that pass rush, that front was causing problems, right? They were doing damage, and that's where you had Allen, Payne, and Wagner together the most, right? Where I'm concerned about the defense personally is the perimeter cornerback group. I think a lot of people are concerned there, and part of that is on the players, right? Emmanuel's got to get better. Ben's got to get better. Their technique's got to get polished up as quickly as possible. How Quan does covering the top, for both those guys, depending on what the assignment is. But then also Joe Witt Jr., like Joe Witt wants to be aggressive. He wants to attack. But at a certain point, as a coach, if your secondary behind him can't afford for you to be as aggressive as you want to be, do you continue to be aggressive and tell them to figure it out? Or do you adjust what you're doing and now take yourself out of your comfort zone to try to help them out? That's going to be a dilemma that he's got to figure out. I can tell you what my preference would be. My preference will always be coach towards what your unit can handle. If your unit can't handle super aggression up front and all that, and being alone on the back end, then you gotta adjust. The problem is, guys who can't handle being alone for 3.5 seconds, they handle being out there for 5.5 seconds, even if they have a little bit of help. Like it's almost, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. So we'll see how it unfolds. But I think that's kind of where the biggest questions lie, just because you haven't actually seen the unit really fully, in real competition yet.
When McGee comes back, who's the last man out, Hampton or Forrest? I'm assuming one of those drops to give him his roster spot back.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, things are going to happen before Jordan comes back, right? So like the roster today isn't going to be the roster that we see when Jordan comes back. So that's a little bit harder to answer. Some of that's going to depend on, performance. Like Michael Walker is actually another guy that's kind of flown under the radar. And literally the last practice before cutdown day, I looked at Zach Selby, the team reporter, and I said, man, Michael Walker's been getting a lot of first team reps when Bobby sits out of a team set or gets a vet day off, and nobody's talking about him. And he's going to make this roster, and we're all going to be silent about it. So, Michael Walker's another guy. But again, how does that performance bleed into the regular season, right? Is Michael Walker a guy, because he's been around a little bit, 5 years. I think this is his 5th or 6th year in the NFL. Is he going to fade? Is he going to step up? So he could be a guy that finds his way on the outside looking in, because again, Dominique Hampton, the thing about him is, remember, he's a draft pick for 1. 2, he's very versatile. He's got that safety and, potential box linebacker ability, and he's got that special teams ability a little bit. I think he's got a little bit of a special teams advantage with the new kickoff rules over a guy like Michael Walker. So if Michael Walker isn't getting the job done as a rotational linebacker, then I could see him potentially also being that guy. But again, that's going to depend. I think you're talking week 5 or 6 minimum before Jordan comes back, and that's just ballpark. That's not. Nobody's told me that. That's just kind of my own thing. So it's going to be there. There's a question there, and I don't want to jinx him, so knock on wood, it doesn't happen, obviously. But like setbacks happen as well, and happen too.
Quickly, I know you got to run. We've been asking everybody that comes on the over under 6.5.
Mhm.
What do you like there, or at least what makes a good season, I guess, for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the floor is 6 wins, right? I think if this team comes away with 6 wins, and obviously how they get those 6 wins matters. But I think the floor is 6 wins. I think if you come away with anything less than 6 wins, there's really not going to be a way to spin it to say that this first year was a success. Now, the good thing about that is you've got all your draft capital, you've got tons of money, and you've got even more money that you could free up with a couple of easy moves that aren't going to be painful at all to make if they decide to make those moves. So, this team, like I think one of you mentioned 40% roster turnover next year. I think that's a very realistic expectation that could possibly happen. Actually, funnily enough, I actually joked at the end of last season when we were standing in the locker room, I was like, man, like 60% of these guys could be gone this time next year. And a couple of reporters were like, nah, that's too high. And here we are. You know what I mean? And I can't even take credit for it. Like I was literally just kind of throwing out a number there, but it's been amazing. But yeah, I think next year again, like 40% turnover, you could certainly see something like that, depending on who steps up and who doesn't. And the thing from 6 wins on, if you get to 7, 8, 9, you're just ahead of schedule. And if you're ahead of schedule, then you found some guys. There's gonna be some 1-year contract guys that get extended, things like that, and that's a great situation to be in. So that 6.5 over under is perfect. That's exactly the line. I'm going to go over. I am a gambler. I do it responsibly. But
Love it.
I've already taken the over on that. So I'm going 7 wins. Just because I do think that, like I said, 6 wins is the floor. And I do like what this team is doing. And I do feel like that pass rush is going to be effective. They're not going to get home 3.5 seconds every time. But I hope and I feel confident enough that they can get home in 3.5 seconds enough that it matters.
David Harrison is the host of Locked On Commanders. We appreciate your time today, bud.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
We will continue on, George.
Let's
there we go. Let's continue on from the discussion we were having right before David got off. Where are you on your concern more for the offense or for the defense? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but I don't know that I've actually asked you, like, what do you think is the biggest concern for you?
So it's interesting. Walking into this, I would have been more concerned with the offense because of there's so many different elements going on, right? We have a new offensive coordinator. We have Anthony Lynn working with Cliff Kingsbury. We have a new quarterback that's coming in who has never played in the NFL before, a new offensive line. There are definitely a lot of concerns, but Logan Paulson brought up a great point. Actually, Arch actually brought up a great point in the comments as well. He talked about how there's a higher floor on the offense, believe it or not, right? Like our wide receivers, we might not necessarily have like these dynamic, explosive Brandon Ayuk types, but we have a Brian Pringle, Jamison Crowder, Noah Brown. Those are solid players. It's a pretty solid wide receiver group. It might not be elite and dynamic, but they're pretty good overall. I think our offensive line will be okay, and I think our run game is going to be okay as well. So I think honestly, it's funny. There's more unknown on the offense, but I think the offense has a higher ceiling, if that makes any sense, because I feel like Jane Daniels could be very explosive and take it to the next level. Just like David said, I think on the defensive side, I'm worried about our pass rush. Like we have Dorrance Armstrong, we have Clelin Ferrell. Like I think they'll generate pass rush, but I feel like they're more edge setters than an explosive pass rusher. And then our defensive backs, like Emmanuel Forbes, I love the guy, but how's he going to do against CeeDee Lamb and AJ Brown and Malik Neighbors? We have great people in our division. I am kind of worried about that. So, I guess my answer is, I'm optimistic about the offense, curious about the defense, worried about the defense. I guess. Let me throw it towards you. What do you think, Doug?
Yeah, I mean they hang their hat on defense, so I think we program ourselves to feel like the defense will be better.
Yeah,
I think that maybe there is more talent on the offense. I am worried that they're learning a whole new system, but I also think sometimes the learning a new system is overblown a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, you're learning it, but these guys play football. Most of these patterns and routes are part of systems that everybody uses. Unless you're really doing something wild, in 2012, when nobody knew in the NFL, what the RPO system from college was basically, that was wild, and people needed time, to get used to that. I don't know that you can. I don't know if that's how it works anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm excited for the offense, and I think this is something we should remember. Dan Quinn's history shows that he's not, and we talked a bit about this on the podcast. He's not the same as Ron Rivera, one of these old school defensive guys that wants to control the clock and win 17-14. Like, look at some of the offensive coordinators had Shanahan in Atlanta. Like, I think he realizes that style doesn't win. That's so hard to win that way. Like,
It is.
the NFL is a race to 40. We
is.
haven't averaged over 20 points a game in a long time. So even if this team could get to 25, average 25, that would be huge for this organization.
Absolutely. And just kind of a little nugget that I heard over the past couple of days, Logan Paulson, one of friend of the show, he was on Take Command with Craig Hoffman. He talked about how Noah Brown has about 2 weeks to kind of get used to this offense before he could potentially play week one. He has this week and the following week to kind of get ready for for week one. He said that Cliff Kingsbury offense isn't complex. He said that there's been a lot of elements that's easy to understand. The actual verbiage isn't too difficult to digest either. And he thinks Noah Brown could actually play week one, which I thought was kind of surprising, which I think is great as well. So there is a good component of that. So I do see some interest there. I can't wait to see on defense. I want to see Frankie Luvu, man. I think he's going to be flying all over the field. We haven't seen Bobby Wagner on defense yet. I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. It's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be fun to watch in that part. Throwing back a question towards you, Doug. How do you feel about the offseason as a whole? Like, we've been doing all these week to week, breakdowns and watching film and talking about all these different things. Where do you think Washington lands in the big picture, right? Like, do you think they're going to be a contender in the NFC? And do you think, Adam Peters has done enough? Like, we had that second waiver wire pick at number 2 overall. Should he have done something there, or are you just trusting the process wholeheartedly right now? Where are you at?
I think they have done just about as good as you can do in an offseason in year one.
Yep.
I think it was interesting. Newmark said the other day, you basically are building your team from February to April. Like, what's happening right now, there should not be many opportunities to dynamically affect your roster right now. I think that probably back around the draft, they had a conversation with San Francisco. Adam Peters got the number and said, thanks, but no thanks. Have fun with that. And did not allow Ayuk or San Francisco to use them as the barometer for getting deal done. They allowed a couple other teams to do that. A couple other teams got into that kind of like, let's see what happens. But for all the people that wanted Ayuk, I think he knew right away the price was too high and that they were never going to do that, and that they never wanted to be a part of the he said that went on this offseason. So I respect him for not doing that, and I really think that's how it went. Now we'll see. They really spent on 2 players, Luvu and Armstrong. I like Luvu a lot. If you talk to fans from Dallas, and you never know what to put in that because they don't want to be salty if a good guy left, but their staff obviously thinks with more snaps and in a starting role that he was worth whatever. What was that contract? 4 years at like 16, 17 mils. I mean,
for who? Armstrong?
Yeah.
It was pretty inexpensive. It was a pretty solid deal. It wasn't a game breaker or anything. Yeah, right. Yeah,
it was mid. It wasn't like what Sweat got in Chicago, but it was not. It wasn't backup money. It was starting money. It was their big acquisition. So if he hits, then I think they've done well. They added a 3rd round pick. I mean, people are complaining about Ridgeway for a 6th. I'll be happy with.
I thought it was a good deal.
Happy with the 6th. Ridgeway wasn't going to play here. So yeah, I mean, I think it's gone really smoothly.
So Doug, I for one, I agree with you, and then 2, I don't think they're done yet. I think it's going to be very interesting come the trade deadline. What I like about Adam Peters, he doesn't hesitate, man. He doesn't care. Like, we as fans, we are attached to certain players. We have beliefs in them. We think they're better than potentially what they truly are. I think during the trade deadline, we could be a buyer or more than likely a seller. I think we might even sell some of our players during the trade deadline, acquire more assets, and build up more of our draft picks going into the draft. Like, those 6s and those 7s and those later round picks as 2/3. I wouldn't be surprised if he moves up in the draft and gets another 2nd round pick next year or something like that. I can see Adam Peters moving around the draft board, which I think is fantastic. So I like what he's doing so far.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at the trade deadline, I'm with you. Like, if we're playing chess and not checkers, I can totally see where they saw moving Jamin Davis to DN and
Mhm.
allowing the league to see him there. If
Mhm.
you I mean, it
I like
sounds
it, Doug.
crazy, but if you
I
could
like
get
it.
like a 5th round pick for Jamin Davis come trade
Mhm.
deadline time,
Mhm.
and it
Yeah.
really probably doesn't affect your win-loss record at that point going forward in the season,
Mhm.
that's a win.
Yeah. We have to remember Adam Peters is a scout first, right? He came up in this industry as a scout, so having more draft picks will build up a team 100%. So I love that. I also want to give a shout out to Archman. Thank you, Arch, for always supporting us.
Yes.
Rockman as well for in the chat as well. Thank you for that. Arch said, I'm a little less worried about perimeter quarters than most. System, coaching, pass rush, nickel, and safeties will help them. They'll be put in more advantageous positions than last year, but I'm still concerned. That is one thing, Doug, I am kind of interested about. I don't think Deron Bland is a exceptional athlete or an elite prospect, right? I think
Mhm.
Dan Quinn's system and Joe Witt's system basically built him up and put him in that situation, right? So I'm curious because I do think Emmanuel Forbes has traits. He's a ball hawking trait, supposedly. I'm curious if he can kind of get right and kind of get his mind right and eventually take that next step. So I think that's going to be interesting. My question to you, though, the safeties, right? Quan Martin, Jeremy Chin, we love them. They sound,
Yes.
we're optimistic, but they haven't proven it over a long period of time. Quan Martin, if you guys remember, for those of you watching and Doug, preseason last year, Quan Martin was getting crushed in the media. They're saying
Yes.
he's
Right.
overdrafted, he dropped the ball. They're saying he wasn't anything, but now he's a starting safety. We're fully confident in it. And Jeremy Chin has started off his career hot, 100 tackles his first year, and was benched for the most part last year. Are you concerned about the safety? Because right now, I don't think I am, but maybe my glass is half full. Doug, what are your thoughts?
Well, you'll remember, I think it was, and maybe it was Adam and Eva with me during our draft segment, but when Jim Nagy came on 2
That was
years
me.
ago,
Oh,
it
it's
was
that.
you, right?
Yeah, it
With
was me.
Quan
Yeah.
Martin, and we asked him about, there were 2 interesting things from that interview, if you remember. One, we asked about Quan Martin because I was
Mm-hmm.
upset about not getting Brian Branch,
Mm-hmm.
and Nagy said that Quan Martin was the fastest riser in that draft, and
Mm-hmm.
he actually was surprised that he was still there, and we were able to get him.
Mm-hmm.
Big things to say. The other one, this doesn't have anything to do with the safeties. You remember we asked about Ricky Stromberg and why he
Yeah.
wasn't at the Senior Bowl, and he
Yeah.
said, "'Cause we didn't have a draftable grade on him."
Yeah.
And I think we both kinda looked at each other like, "Not even a draftable grade?" You can see where that was. So, I guess more anything, and Jim Nagy is part of this scout group. I mean, you're talking about Adam Peters, those guys kinda grew up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where they see the game together. As far as Chin goes, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Last year in Carolina is like trying to grade somebody that played for Washington. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, doesn't seem fair because that was total disarray. I like the 2 of them. Obviously, you've got Sandra Strill that goes into the nickel. They're going to be who they're going to be
Mm-hmm.
more so, I think, is like big nickel, whatever the money back is that your safety comes down. I mean, I think you're going to see 4 safeties on the field, quite a
Mm-hmm.
bunch.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if they actually get like Allen outside at edge
Mm.
a little bit or Payne and use some of these guys so that you're able to get all 3 of your good D tackles on the field at one time. I could see that. I think they're going to be really interesting that way. And as we've been told a bunch, George, the fastest way to get to the quarterback is straight up the middle.
Absolutely.
So while everybody else is worried about tackles and DNs, our strength is right up the middle. And if we can get there in 3 seconds, I mean, that's what really helps the edges on the boundary corners to me.
Absolutely. I definitely think that this season, I think, maybe I'm giving them too much credit. We're going to see a lot of positionless football on the defensive side of the ball. I feel like they're going to
Yeah.
move people around. I think
People
the
hate
fact,
hearing the word position
yeah,
flex,
it's not position flex, it's
but
positionless.
position flex is a good thing
Yeah,
if you know how to use it.
absolutely. Because I think we might have like 5 corners, I believe, maybe even 4. We have a small amount of corners on our actual 53 roster. And I think that's because Quan Martin's going to flex into the nickel a little bit, and Jeremy Chin's going to move more in the box, and Percy Butler's going to be back there a little bit. They were going to bounce around, so I'm excited about that.
Deluxe isn't wrong. I've heard they've been moving Mikey outside some, which is
I saw that
interesting.
for sure. Yeah, I saw Mikey outside. He also was right about this. He said Chin got hurt by coaching and scheme change. There definitely was an emotional falling out between the coaches and Jeremy Chin. So that's definitely one thing there. I'm interested by that. We'll see how that goes. Alex had a great question. Thank you, Alex, for listening. I appreciate it, bro. He said, "I'm worried about the receiving core. Do you all have any thoughts?" Doug, you want to answer this? Want me to go ahead, or what do you think?
We can both have a stab at it. I mean, I
Sure.
think I'm less worried than some, just because like Cliff has routinely had this way of scheming guys open. It is friendly that way. I like the mix that they have. I mean, obviously it would be Terry outside. I think Diami goes outside, and then Zacchaeus, I think, starts at the nickel. And I've said this a lot the last couple of days, but when Matt Waldman was on with me Tuesday, he said that he's in Atlanta and he knows Zacchaeus is wide receiver, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Wide receiver coach. And when he was scouting Zacchaeus in college, they actually used him in like the Debo Samuel role. And they haven't, like, none of the teams in the NFL have used him that way. He said he thinks that's probably what they'll do here, like in that big slot role. So while we don't have on paper, it looks like you move Jahan Dotson out, and all of a sudden a receiving core that nationally I think people were kind of high on and intrigued by. It's kind of like the DNs, right? We've replaced some names with guys that maybe aren't the names, but I think they probably fit what we do here.
Yeah.
And I don't think swapping Dotson for Brown, the new guy Brown, Noah Brown. I don't think that's like some big. We didn't lose out big there, right? At least not statistically.
I think Washington has enough. Like from my perspective, like they don't have the elite dynamic 1-2 combo like let's say the Eagles have. They don't have that in per se. But I think honestly, Washington has enough, and there are high floors for these guys. Like you talked about, Diamond Brown's. He's the biggest flipper or whatever. I can't think of the best word. He's the biggest game changer of the entire wide receiver group. If he's good, it's going to be a pretty solid group over there. Let me read this off to you. This is the Ravens receiving core: Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, Tylan Wallace, Deontay Hardy, Devontae Walker. Like that's not impressive at all, right?
No, right.
They have Lamar Jackson. He can elevate all of them, right? I think our hope here in DC is, Jaden Daniels can elevate these guys. He's dynamic enough. I think collectively with Zach Ertz, and I think Sinnott, for all you listening, and Doug, I'm high on Sinnott. I was actually kind of lower on him earlier, but once I start seeing him in the preseason, he's going to be wild in the open field. It's going to be hard to tackle. So I think there's going to be a big element there. So I think collectively it's going to be more of a committee approach. I think Terry McLaurin's going to be that guy that gets filtered to a lot. So I kind of think altogether our wide receiver is good enough. And I wouldn't be surprised if early on next year they actually draft a wide receiver in the first round or maybe in the second round. Maybe even first round. I know offensive tackle is the dream scenario potentially, but I think with these exploding wide receiver prices, they might just be smart and just draft the wide receiver and be like, you know what, let's build it up because Terry McLaurin's 30 years old. We'll get a young guy in the mix, kind of 5 years of that control, and go that direction with it. So definitely very interesting.
It wouldn't shock me at all if they go wide receiver, corner, wide receiver, DN in that order next year, or corner, wide receiver, corner. They need help on both those spots, and they're going to have to obviously get younger and more explosive there. Hopefully they're not drafting high enough to do that.
Yeah.
And of course you're hoping that you've got Cole. I mean, if Coleman works out, of course, that's the dream, right? Because then you don't have to worry about it next year.
Absolutely.
Also, they keep saying and over and over and over again. And if it wasn't true, I don't think they'd keep saying it. Like Ertz has looked like Philadelphia Ertz again. And even that first year, remember, Arizona traded up a bunch for him to get him out there. If they can protect him, if he can give you 20 impactful snaps, George, each game, and that's all. We don't need him out there, digging out safeties down the field necessarily. But if he can give us 20 impactful snaps, along with Bates, who will do that kind of nasty work, and Sinnott, who can do the nasty work. And I think Deluxe maybe mentioned earlier getting Yankoff down into that H. I can see formations where you've got Jaden out there and Sinnott and Yankoff in the backfield at the same time.
Yeah,
I receiver sets out there. Like there's some interesting things they can do. Like they may not be explosive, but they've got guys that can do a lot of different interesting things, which I think will make the offense hard to game plan for.
I agree. I think Doug, like the reason why Dotson became expendable is I don't think they're going to walk out with 3 wide receiver sets all the time. Like I think like we expect, potentially with air raid, we keep hearing that potentially. I don't think it's going to be that direction. I think it's going to be more like 2 wide receivers, 12 personnel, 2 tight ends out there, maybe even 2 running backs. Maybe having Eckler and B-Rob in the backfield and kind of being dynamic in that regard too. I think they're going to utilize their weapons in different ways. I can see Diami and Terry getting a lot of the snaps on the field that way. So I'm interested in how it's going to play out. So for sure, it's going to be definitely interesting to watch.
Well, we've had both Chrissy Freud, who knows a ton about the air raid, who studied it, and also Sam Fortier. Remember, who had told us when he was early on in the business, was out there with Cliff when he was still in college. And this notion, I think this air raid notion gets the word gets overused a bunch. It's more about concepts and formations. And as Chrissy told us, most of those formations are being used in all the offense all the time. So I think they'll be explosive. We'll see what happens. Next week, George, on Friday, we'll have our preview show with JP Finley. Very excited about that.
Absolutely.
So very excited to get back on our regular schedule for those that are watching. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And then looks like we'll have the fellas back to do the film reviews on Tuesday, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, it's great content for the year. And, Alex, Deluxe, Rockman, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. It's going to be awesome, man. Mondays, we're going to have some game reviews. Tuesday, we're going to have film review. Wednesday, Opposition Wednesday. It's going to be a blast. It's going to be awesome. A lot of good stuff coming up.
All right, buddy. Well, I'll see you next week.
All right, Doug. Peace out, bro.